right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to our virtual event this evening. It's wonderful to see so many people active in the chat already. That's awesome. And for those of you who are talking with your fellow Fairfield University MFA program students who might not be on the Crowdcast, we are also streaming this live on the Bank Square Books Facebook page, so you can check it out there as well. My name is Anastasia, and I am the events manager for Bank Square Books and Savoy Bookshop and Café. And we're very delighted that you were able to join us for this virtual event this evening. I should have a few quick pieces of business to go over before we get started. I just want to point out a few helpful features on Crowdcast, one of which is the chat that you have all figured out already. So you guys are good to go. Chat away, engage. It's not a real event, sadly, in the sense that we can't all be here together and have those laughing moments, but this is sort of the next best thing. So please take good advantage of that. You can submit questions for Karen and Derek through the Ask a Question button, which is down at the bottom of the screen. And we will get to as many of those questions as we can during the event. I will also monitor the Facebook stream, and any questions that are submitted on that, I will try to move them over here. And for those of you who are Fairfield MFA attendees, I see it's already showing up in the chat. There is that St. Michael's Conference Zoom room afterwards that you guys can join for further discussion. So if you'd like to buy a copy of Karen's wonderful book, the music book right here, there is a green button right below the stream here that you can click, and that'll take you to buy a copy of the book. I have 30 pristine copies of this wonderful book, and Karen has signed some book plates that should be arriving back to us shortly that will accompany them. And with that, I am going to introduce you to Karen Osborn, who is here tonight to talk to us about her latest novel, The Music Book. Karen Osborn is the author of 4 novels and has been compared to Ian McEwan, Jodi Picoult, and Russell Banks. The New York Times has called her work psychologically sophisticated, and the Washington Post has said her writing is an extraordinary effort to engage the American condition as we find it now. In addition to being an author, Ms. Osborn, as many of you know, teaches fiction writing at Fairfield University's MFA program. And here to speak with Karen this evening is Derek Ivan Webster, who is the Associate Director for the Arts at Yale University. So Karen and Derek are going to have a dialogue about the music book for about 40-45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. The event will run for about an hour. And now I am going to leave it to Karen and Derek.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate it. And Karen, thank you for inviting me to this. I feel privileged to be part of this conversation, certainly. I think as a MFA student, current MFA student, I know Karen's work well, both as an extraordinarily talented writer, but also as an amazing teacher. I've taken a couple of different seminars with her, advanced novel writing, and also poetry, which is something you're doing now more often. And I think from that perspective, I was really drawn to your work in a couple of different ways. And we got a chance to talk back and forth as you were my most recent mentor, faculty mentor. We got a chance to talk back and forth, and some of the craft conversation that we had actually revolved around some of the work that you did in your most recent novel. So I thought it might be a great idea to maybe unpack a little bit of that. I was drawn to it from my own work based on the strength of your work in voices and working through memory, having different layers of a timeline exposed in sort of a frayed fashion. So maybe to start, if you wanted to give us a bit of an overview of the novel and maybe an excerpt that could give us an entry point into that, at least one aspect of that voice in your work.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I'll read I'll give you a synopsis of the novel, and then I'm going to read just the first few pages of it, and just to give you a sense of the writing. So the music book tells the story of Irina Seisel, a young female cellist who is a talented musician and has a fierce passion for music and a desire to play among the best. So beginning in the 1950s, a time when orchestral groups refused women even the chance to audition, Irina is given the opportunity to substitute for an up-and-coming modern music quartet at a music festival where she is the only female musician. It's held in Newport, Rhode Island, and the music performances are held in the Breakers mansion, where where they held many classical music concerts in the 50s. So years later, in the memory unit of a nursing home, she recalls through flashes her unsettling relationship with the group's enigmatic composer when she receives a sonata he left for her in his will. She relives the 4 days she spent with him at that festival, the difficult aftermath of the affair, and the few other times she saw him during her life. As her mind shuts down, she re-experiences the intense joy she felt playing music and her struggle to enter a male-dominated profession. So this is, again, just the first couple of pages. 1953, Providence, Rhode Island. The train stopped and her cello hit up against her side. "Here, miss," a young man handed her suitcase down, and she went quickly out ahead, across the crowded platform and through the small station. Outside, cars were bumper to bumper. Windshields flashed in the sun. Businessmen hurried toward the station, and a woman dragged a suitcase and a child, one in each hand. The sunlight was hot on the concrete sidewalk. She held a hand above her eyes and spotted the DeSoto they told her to look for behind a large station wagon with wooden panels. Charles Breedlove sprang from the driver's seat. "Irina, right? Irina Seisel?" She was 21 and newly graduated from the conservatory. There was that blouse she'd worn with a scallop neckline and a dark skirt gathered at the waist. She was strong-looking, large-boned with wide shoulders and a square, determined jaw, soft gray eyes, and long hair that fell forward when she played the cello, parting like a curtain to reveal a driven but dreamy expression, as if she saw phantom shadows. She'd been hired to perform at the music festival last minute because the cellist with the modern strings, a new ensemble group in New York City, had broken his arm. Patrick Dempsey, the group's violist, had phoned her. They'd had trouble finding someone, and John Pincer, who taught her at the conservatory, had given him her name. They were playing the final event in a 4-day festival that would showcase classical music from the Baroques to the modern, and debut a new composition by Arthur Cohen, a rising young composer and their pianist. Was she available? Could she do it? Had she studied or performed modern classical music? It was a difficult piece. Charles drove through the crowded streets. Cars glistened in the sunlight. Horns blared. At the far side of town, she smelled the stink of the fish canneries through the open windows. Then they reached the city's outskirts, where they drove faster. A small track of recently built houses appeared, then disappeared, and billboards flashed by too fast to read them. As they left the city, the road wound closer to the ocean, where tall seagrasses grew by the roadside, and the water appeared in patches. "I love a road that winds along the coast, don't you?" Charles called out. A damp wind blew through the car as they turned into the 2-lane road close to the water. When they crossed the bridge that spanned the inlet, her hair streamed out of the window. Above her, the sky felt huge. They passed marshes and fields thick with brush. In the bright air, everything gleamed. Beachfront hotels and small white houses with dark green trim and the ocean behind them. The sun was a glowing white ball. Something was about to happen that would change whatever happened afterward.
It's fantastic. I think that's a great reading that actually opens up one of the first things I was going to ask about, and we could kind of talk through. Clearly, I think everyone who knows your work knows how much research you put into your projects, and this is no exception. I do feel that this one, in some ways goes even, deeper and broader in the different layers of research that it must have required. There's the level of the historicity and just like the setting and the time, which feels so authentic through your writing. But there's even the more specific angle of the musicality and the sense of the new music and post-war music. And, reading this, I feel like you're an expert in all these things. And even to the level of the language used in describing the personal journey of a young, talented musician. So I feel like there's so much going on here, and not even to mention the memory unit and what's going on with that sort of angle in the story. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about those many layers, how you approached them, and what it felt like to be digging in so many different directions, and how and when did you cut yourself off from all that research?
It was overwhelming, I will say that. Well, there was the research of the place, which was really fun. I always research the place if I'm writing about a real place. But you're right, the research into music was sort of this huge pile of books and recordings that I went through. I have a sister who is a pianist, a classical pianist in Boston, and I actually my whole family is creative. So when I was growing up, my parents loved classical music; they played it all the time. So I heard a lot of it, so I'm not a musician myself, but I grew up around it, which I think makes the difference. Is probably partly why I chose this subject matter. My sister plays in a couple of different orchestras in Boston. One of them is BMOP, which is the Boston Modern Orchestra Project. And so they're one of the main orchestras in the country that are both performing and making it their business to record a lot of the modern music by composers that's being lost right now.
Yeah.
So I've listened to a lot of that music, and I've sort of learned how to listen to modern music. If you've listened to it, you know it's different than traditional classical
taste, right?
Yeah. It doesn't have the same melodic patterns, so it sounds dissonant often to our ears. It doesn't have regular timing sometimes. It's difficult to play. My sister was a big resource for me, and how do you learn this type of music, and how do musicians play together? Because this is an art form that can only happen if they're all playing together, as part of a quartet, and they're very dependent on one another. And as you can imagine, you get really close really quickly because you're spending so much time together doing something that you all feel very passionate and intense about. And then the historical research, I was at Bowling Green for a semester. I was a writer, the fiction writer in residence for a few months there. And they have one of the reasons I took that position is they have a really good music library. And they have a really good program in historical music. So there were a couple of graduate students there who really helped me with what to read. And it is a fascinating time. Right after World War II, so many of the classical music composers were German. And so right after World War II, the composers who were had started and were running this very kind of worldwide, it drew composers from all over the world. It was every summer they'd have a festival where they'd give a lot of talks about music. And they're called the Darmstadt talks. Anyway, I read some of those that happened. They start in 1946. And it's really interesting because it's linked to World War II and these composers really feeling that music has to go in a different direction. They can't rely on these predictable patterns anymore because that's associated with what happened with the Nazis.
Yeah. I wonder if you'd be willing to do another short reading that sort of exposes a little bit of the depth of that musicality of research involved. I think maybe that first conversation between Arthur and Irina when they sort of dive into this back and forth of what is music.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just read part of it. I'll start partway in, I think. This is after the first rehearsal the next day, and Irina, or as they call her, Rini, feels like she's messed it up and she's really in over her head. So she's kind of in a state already. And then Arthur follows her, that she's walking along the cliffs, and he's trying to, at first, reassure her that she's done well. But then they get into this argument eventually, and it's this argument about music that is going to be ongoing throughout the book and really throughout the times in their lives when they see each other over the years. And there's a lot of different aspects to this argument about music, but essentially it is the contrast between modern music, which Arthur Cohen, as a composer of modern music, is arguing for, versus traditional and more traditional classical music. So it's just a little bit of that argument. This is also the scene that leads up to the beginning of her affair with him. So I'll kind of read up to the beginning of that, and then that's where I think I'll stop. Okay, so this is Arthur speaking about modern music. He says, true music divorces itself from technique and expectations. That was Schoenberg's purpose in creating serial music, to do away with expectations. We're living in an unpredictable world, and music divorced from expectations and technique is the only relevant expression of it. And what are you left with if you do away with expectations and technique? She asked. She's been arguing for technique as a musician. Nothing, she told herself. Chaos. Sound, he said, answering her right away. He didn't even have to take a second to think. He already knew. Not a performer's ego, but pure and powerful sound. Well, I know what I experience when I play, she said. She wasn't shouting, but she spoke fiercely. Something had snapped into place. It was herself. You can't tell me what I experience is ego. It's not. I should maybe back up to say that Arthur is, by now you know this, he's several years older than she is, and he's also really established. He's like an up-and-coming composer. She just got out of conservatory. I'm not trying to tell you what you experience. He threw up his hands. The path curved close to the edge of the cliffs. Rocks and scrub brush fell away to one side, and on the other side she saw verdant lawns and flowering bushes. You can't know what happens inside a musician, she said. You can hear the music that's produced, but you can't see inside the musician and know what he or she is experiencing. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that music is bigger than we are. He stopped walking, but she kept going so that he was forced to shout. She pictured him screaming at the ocean, the ridiculousness of that. He was claiming that ego was what kept musicians from playing well, yet he seemed subsumed by his own importance. His sonata was more difficult than any music she'd ever played. Some of the musical patterns made no sense, and there was no consistent melody. Maybe it was difficult simply because it was bad. She wondered how much knowledge he had of the cello. Any piece of music has its own life, Arthur shouted. Our work is to experience that life. Performance isn't about making an audience happy or making them understand or appreciate anything. It isn't about the audience or the musician. It's about the music itself. The medium is everything. The sky was darkening, but the air was still bright, shimmering with heat. She could see far out into the ocean, all the way to the thick line of the horizon. They descended closer to the water and reached a break in the path where it was possible to scramble down to the ocean over the rocks. She held her shoes in one hand and didn't stop until she reached the bottom. She threw herself down on a narrow strip of sand and shells next to the water. Moments later, breathing heavily, Arthur lowered himself beside her. If she wasn't so tired, she would have stood up and walked back at the fastest possible pace. His hair whipped in front of his face, the wind. He was breathless from shouting. She hated the sound of his voice, so passionate and certain, and yet she could have lived off that sound. It cut both ways, straight through her. Performing new music demands courage. You have to reinvent yourself to play it, but it's the only music worth playing. He looked at her, glaring with sudden intensity. Patrick says you were offered a teaching position at a music academy in Boston. Yes, she told him. He moved closer, inches away. She could see every line in his face, the way his cheekbones were too prominent and his forehead too high. If you could even consider teaching at a music academy, you shouldn't be performing. For a long second, she stared back. She had a terrible urge to spit at him. What do you know about it? You're talented, and I think you may have the ability to actually produce a pure or true sound with your instrument, as you've argued. But in order to do that, you'll need to devote yourself. To be a true musician, you have to want to play music badly enough that you can't think of doing anything else. That's the one thing I do know. For a moment, they continued to stare at each other. Then she grabbed 2 fistfuls of his hair. It slid between her fingers, the type of hair that would untangle easily if you took a brush to it. She yanked hard enough that she expected some of it to come out in her hands, but instead his face moved into hers. Everything about it looked distorted. The shelf of his nose, the indentations where his eyes rested. What happened next happened quickly, without her thinking about it.
Wow. Great excerpt. So I think that's a powerful scene on a couple of different, for the reason of, I think you and I talked previously about, your approach to the story had sort of been, originally it was going to be a take on a romance for you, and then was it going to be anti-romance, like that sort of give and take. I think there's something really interesting in here where the musicality, the relationship almost is entirely absorbed by their relationship to music. It's almost like they're attracted to one another, mostly for a shared yearning for something elusive, this idea of a pure sound or a perfection in music that most people have no ear or drive for. That's a theme that I think recurs throughout the novel in really interesting ways, culminating, towards the end in a very powerful way. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about your intention for that theme, or any subtext involved in it, or any reasons that you sort of like layered that sense of pure sound and its elusiveness, particularly for Irina's character.
Yeah, I gotta say I didn't do that intentionally initially. Just to make it clear that I don't have all this planned out. None of it's planned out in my head. I'm not very, very smart that way. I think that he, Arthur, this idea for the pure sound, that comes up in some of the writings of the modern composers that I had read, that there was this search for it. And I was really intrigued by that, because a pure sound would be like the sound that's underneath the other sounds, right? You think about that as a writer, like what are the words that are underneath the words on the surface of the page? Well, yeah. I couldn't even begin to say what they are, but I was intrigued by that, and I don't know, and I think I mentioned this to you maybe once before. The other thing I read while I was working on this book was, I like Oliver Sacks quite a bit, and I read his Musictopia, which is about music and how it happens in the brain, and the way in which music is the thing that, when a lot of other things go, the music, you can still hear music. You can still hear sound. Like sound is somehow still important. Well, they know it's the last thing to go before you die too. And so that seemed to me tremendously important, that sound was, that pure sound would be something that would be worthwhile of a lifelong search. And I think I can imagine, especially, knowing my sister all my life, that is true of musicians too, searching for the, like when you're tuning an instrument, especially a stringed instrument, you can never get like the perfect A. It's like, how close can you get to it? And right. I could just imagine that obsession with it. So I think that is one of the things, you're right. When you said that, I hadn't thought of that, but I think you're right. That is one of the things that probably is underneath that strong immediate attraction they have to each other, but also the source of their maybe their argument here.
Right.
She thinks she can get it with her instrument.
There's something in there that I found so interesting, and I think it speaks towards that layer of that reach for something that is beyond, the filter that we have. So it's almost like the sense of the artist as a vessel, and trying to capture something, and as strong and as clear and as capable as the vessel might become, it always feels like we're filtering something. And I'm not a musician, but I thought you did such a beautiful job of speaking towards that yearning within an artist of any stripe. And I thought that was a really powerful, a resonant piece of the novel that I found throughout. So clearly music is so important here in so many different ways. There's the side where you're very, at least in the final product, you're very straightforward about structuring this with movements based on musical movements. And there's clearly, as we mentioned, so much sense of authenticity in the research and a expertise and understanding. And there's a lot of musical language that's used throughout. I would also argue there's a tremendous amount of motif and theme and recurrence and even the coda that comes back, in at the end. Maybe, shifting as much, into that craft side, if you could tell us a little bit more about, was that always intended? Was it found along the way? What did the process look when you were like, oh, wait, this could be, the musical movements could become the structure for this? And how much give and take was there in terms of, story decision and structural decisions that you made based upon finding the patterns, that were resonant on a musical level?
Well, it's funny. You put all that so beautifully. It was just an accident. And that's awful to say. A
happy accident.
It was a happy accident. I mean, I really, I struggled with writing this. I am more with which we'll maybe look at later, which is these little passages that happen in her mind that when she's in the memory, I call them the memory unit passages in my mind. They're they're shorter and they're different in style and they're kind of spread throughout the book. So the feeling I wanted is that all of these up close memories are held within this memory unit. Even though the memory unit is kind of fragile and it doesn't appear real often, the main writing in this is the up close memories. So they started to fall into a natural pattern because the first section of the book is the 4 days, and that's really 2 sections because I have the performance. There's a kind of a real emotional break between the 3rd day and then the 4th day, which is their performance, and then what occurs after the performance, where she leaves, and then that's kind of the culmination of this affair that she's having as well with the composer. So then the 3rd section ended up being all of the times after that she sees him. And I realized, oh, that is a recapitulation. It's perfect.
Yeah.
And so it just fit that way. And I didn't know that I would have a coda. That just came at the very end. I happened to write that, not knowing I would write it. So it was as if the universe was cooperating with me, helping me out. That
perfect note, right? That perfect sound in the background was speaking.
Yeah, I was just following it along by then.
So would it be worthwhile to take a look at, I think there was a passage that you could read that kind of dives into this idea of, I think it's when they're describing the moment in the performance, right? With Life Wasn't Orchestrating Music, that it's like 102 or 103 or something. Do you want to read that? Yeah.
Okay, yes, that would be, so this is the second half of the performance that they do, so of Arthur Cohen's music. It's just to set the scene. It's in the Breaker's Mansion in that big great room, which of course was very overwhelming for this young musician who had never played to a big audience before, a few hundred people. And this is when classical music is at its peak. I don't think I'm going to read that part, so I'll just tell you that this festival is taking place at a time when classical music is at its height in America. Leonard Bernstein's orchestra program and is playing on the radio to all these large audiences. There are large audiences for in-person performances, and just in 10 years, the audiences are going to shrink dramatically. But these musicians don't know that. They think they're on the way up still to that peak, but they're actually at the peak. It's about to fall the other way. Okay, so the sun was setting in the windows at the back of the hall, tiny and orange and glittering. Arthur and Charles' high notes ended the second movement. Then after a brief pause, Renee entered the music again as the final movement began. The tempo increased, and next to her, Charles bowed furiously. It felt impossibly fast, and for a second she was afraid she'd lose a note, but she didn't. Her instrument had its own life. Waves of sound swept above her. They were coming from her cello, but the sound felt bigger than that, as if it was its own entity, rising. They played on, and the music stopped making sense as phrases became disconnected and hard to follow. Then, all at once, everything snapped. She played a wrong note and had to focus completely on the score. For a second, she lost the others, stopped hearing them, but then suddenly she was with them again, right there where she should be in the music. The four of them were communicating, creating something substantial and new between them. Her playing became more assured and vigorous. Colors materialized out of the notes, tangible and real, having nothing to do with the colors from the audience or the setting sun. She saw purples and blues, crimson, tawny browns. Each musical phrase built upon the others. She felt her body vibrating with the cello. Her arm pulled back and forth on the bow. Her chest could barely stand the pressure. Any minute, her heart would explode. Then the tempo changed again, and the notes howled. They pushed her into another dimension. Every nerve switched on, and in a cacophony of sound, time spread out, diffuse and unmoving. What the four of them were making was beyond understanding or language, beyond reason. Music was time, and tempo demanded precise counting, but they had exploded time's boundaries. In that moment, she knew absolutely what she was meant to do for the rest of her life, perform like this.
Wow, amazing.
And I'll just say that she's convinced she'll be able to do that. But of course, in those days, it doesn't happen for a long time.
Right. She's at her own sense of a moment of zenith where she thinks she can still make it into the quartet and she doesn't know exactly what's happening. Within days, she'll know more.
Oh, that's a great connection. Yeah, you're right. It's a parallel.
So music is time is such an interesting line in that. And I think it sort of bridges over to another concept that memory is here, right? If music is important, it's important in conversation with memory throughout the novel. And that memory is explored in so many different ways, and you have the memory unit pieces that trickle throughout. And for me, to my ear, there's such a musicality to the way that you string along the progress or digress of that memory, right? And even some of the specific things that you do with broken couplets of sound or reference that you often pick up at the beginning of chapters or in transition points. Could you tell us a little bit more about the either the process or intention behind having that kind of fragmentation in the voice that had an almost counterpuntal kind of musicality to it? What did that feel like in writing?
Yeah, well, that was the hardest part stylistically, was to get those right. And I rewrote them a lot of times. I got feedback from some other writers on it at one point, especially a friend of mine who's was a really wonderful playwright. Anyway, that I guess it was something about the spoken word. So she's not, she's having small strokes is the reason she's in the memory unit. So there's also this, I wanted this sense of a whole lifetime in those moments, or in those, which is not, this doesn't really take place over a very long period of time where she's having these memories. And that part is based actually from years ago on with my grandfather, who had these small strokes and was in a memory unit. And I could tell visiting him that you knew from little things that he said that he was having these up close memories. But at the time that he was with us, the present moment was almost non-existent.
Right.
So that's kind of what I was after, and the fragmentation, and yeah.
Well, it worked beautifully throughout. If you wanted, maybe that opening of chapter 12 might be a great example of some of that kind of very poetic fragmentation.
Yeah. You know, I may read, I think I'll read a little of 11 because it's a little shorter. It's a little more contained, maybe. But it's similar. And the other thing that you're going to hear in this is that there's some other dialogue, because those are the voices she's hearing. She's not speaking at all, but those are the voices that are her daughters in and out visiting her, and there are nurses once in a while coming in, or aides. She drove north, then south, and everything flashed quickly past. This comes after a chapter where she's taken a long car ride. That hat she'd worn, the dress with the lace trim her mother had sewn onto it, also right after her remembering her wedding. The bouquet she'd held, made with white and purple irises that her sister-in-law had bought at the florist on the corner, arranging them at the last minute. She had waited at stations, boarded trains, and driven for miles. It was a narrow road with a few turns, and she passed houses among the trees. The sky turned overcast, and later there was a sunset. Eat a little of this. Lie back now. I'll just prop you up. I'll just help you get that. She would keep going, had to, couldn't stop, couldn't turn a deaf ear. All around her was a great churning. Mother, did you hear me? I'm coming later tomorrow around 5. I'll bring Kia with me to see you. Mother, that concert is all arranged. It'll be in a few weeks. Arthur Cohen's niece says it will be wonderful. It will lift your spirits. She heard what they said, heard voices and steps in the hallway, heard an orchestra playing, heard air moving through the vents and the sound of the motor beneath everything else. It went on day and night, a beautiful sound, a difficult sound, the sound she'd always known and that was always present. She'd heard it and knew she had to continue, couldn't stop. She stood on a narrow strip and saw she had no choice. This sound was larger than her, would not let go. And later, when she had walked so far and could go no farther, she would see how far she'd come and where the end lay.
Wow. So good. So there's that sound again.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I thought off the top of my head I'd read that one too, just because you've been talking about that.
So to me, we talked about, and maybe we're running low on time, so we want to leave room for Q&A. So maybe we'll finish with this question of the coda, because I absolutely love the coda, and I know you've had different feedback regarding the coda, and it might not have been intended originally, that sort of thing. But for me, it's perfect. It fits that pattern, and it brings back the themes and motifs in such a masterful way. As again with the musicality, that these things are brought back and they're reintroduced, but they're shuffled a bit, and we come out with a different resolution, or potentially a different resolution on how we're reading this story and this character. So I love the coda, and I would love you to tell us a little bit more about how it came about and how it almost didn't come about, or whatever you'd like to share.
I just didn't picture it. Is there an echo? Can you hear me?
No, I can hear you. I think you're okay.
Am I okay? I didn't plan it. I was going to have it end differently, and then I kept writing the ending out. And I always know that if I write a scene a few times and it doesn't work, usually I have the wrong plot point. So I just gave it up. And then one day I just found myself writing this ending, and before I knew it, I had written it, and I was it was very emotional. I got upset when I was writing it, and I wasn't even quite sure why. It was like the ending. It was like the I think it was just like I was being told by the book what the ending had to be. So a lot of this language, I almost feel like I can't take responsibility for it, but I will. I don't know if I'll take all the praise for it, but I'll take the responsibility. But you should read it. You read this last part.
Yeah, so I think it's beautiful. I think it's culminating. I think it's, you know, having taken your poetry seminar, I think it's poetry. Yeah, so I was just going to read. I won't read too much of it because it's short, and I don't want to expose any context for those who might, you know, still be reading the book. But just enough to give you some of this language and just the talent involved in the approach, and the feeling that all these things that we're talking about, the one note, the themes, the structure, the search, the memory as time, it all comes back into this in a really, really, you know, profound way.
I'm so glad. I didn't do it on purpose.
If you keep making the same beautiful mistake, it's not a mistake.
Okay, thank you.
She was at the top where the musicians were warming up, and she took off her clothes. She took off her dress and her underthings and shoes. She took off one shadow after another. She removed each layer: hope, love, disappointment, regret. Saw they didn't matter. Beauty was at the top. Someone said, someone knew. The musicians were beginning to tune, and she found her place, as if she'd never left but had stayed at the top where the concert was taking place. She tuned herself, strummed each string. The air was dry and airless, and the hilltop was like a giant sheet. She fell into it. All around her now the music was beginning. Sound would last. All around her now the sound would last. Beauty would last. She unwound the last bit and saw herself briefly in a train window. The image flashed, then went out. She took the music out of herself. She removed the notes and the coda. So good.
You could say more about, like, because you had all these good ideas that I hadn't even thought of about the way in which things come back into that. You know.
So I think for me, and it's open to questions. So please throw out any Q&A, and we can pick up questions as they come in. For me, beyond just the beauty of that language, and I think structurally, there's such a feeling of completion that comes in with that coda. I go back to that sense of the broken couplet that is finally completed, right?
Oh.
We get to, you know, throughout you have these, and you mentioned spoken word and that feeling of, you know, so we've had these, you know, these contrasting, you know, half there reaching, you know, trying to say something, but the memory's not quite there, or she's not sure. And when we land on this couplet that's in the same form, but is actually like carrying this back to us in an anchored way. Someone said, someone knew. Again, I think, you know, you can call it a mistake if you like, or you can say it's coming from somewhere abroad. But clearly, you know, the vessel of your writing was able to capture something really powerful here. And so, yeah, thank you.
Well, that's interesting, because that was in my head over and over again. She didn't know, couldn't say. Like, that's the couplet that keeps, you know, coming back. And that was one of the decisions at the end. Like, how many times do I repeat that before it's too much? But yeah, it had to be repeated.
I think it worked, and I think it felt, with that sense of fragmentation, it felt like it was degrading. It was pulling farther apart. It felt like we were losing the focus of that. And then for it to come back in with the coda, suddenly clear as a bell, like back. She's returned to that one note. It was just beautiful. Yeah,
thank you. She gets the pure sound at the end. Yeah.
So if you haven't made it to the coda yet, you have many good things in store. The other side of that, and we mentioned motif and bringing, sort of like musicality back into this. So in that, the distillation of those 2 pages of the coda, you bring back the train, you bring back the hill, you have that couplet. Again, like, it couldn't have worked had you not put in as much work wherever it happened, whether you went back and traced it back in or just found it naturally along the way. It couldn't go off like it did without the tremendous amount of work that you put into making sure those patterns would bite in the appropriate places.
Well, thank you. Well, the train was on purpose because she has this train ride at the end of the festival. She takes the train back from Providence to Boston, and it's a really hard trip for her, an emotional trip for her. And so the train ride, that keeps coming back, like she's on a train or she's got to catch a train, and which I think also has that sense of. I remember when my mother was dying, she kept thinking she had to pack her suitcase. And I was thinking at the time, well, yeah, you're going somewhere. I can see how that would come up, that you'd have that association. So that is a theme throughout. The other thing is the sound. And there's a sound that she's hearing at the beginning. I read that, when I read that chapter 11, there was a sound, and that keeps coming back. And it's the heating vents. The air pouring through the vents is what she's hearing. It's a sound that never stops. She thinks it's a sound that's under all sound. And it sounds like it's coming from some kind of a great, huge machine that's underneath the memory unit, which of course is her brain as well as the unit of the hospital. So it's the furnace, really. But eventually, my intention, at least, is that it becomes her heartbeat, finally, that she's hearing.
Yeah. So we do have a question from social media. How did you begin your career as a writer, Karen?
Well, I began it as a poet. So maybe that makes some sense.
Right. One might have guessed based upon this writing, right?
Yeah. Most of my graduate work was in poetry. I became a novelist afterwards.
So let's see, is there another question here? How much of how Irina feels about music, making music, is familiar to you from the writing? How it feels when you're inside the process?
Oh yeah, that's a good connection, and I do think that a lot of the writing in those passages is about the experience of the imagination and of creativity, kind of an inward experience. It's the first time in a novel that I've tried to write so much about inner experiences, I think. It's very different from my other books in that way. But yeah, a lot of those passages were actually not passages I struggled with. I found the language to that pretty quickly. And I think part of it is because I was relying on my own inner experience when I'm writing. Yeah. So that's a good connection.
Yeah, that was Rachel asked that.
That's good.
We've got a kind of an extension now that you've exposed your poetry background. How does writing poetry affect your fiction writing?
I think the language, the word choice, particularly, it's interesting because Katie Sadowski, some of you saw her graduate presentation, talked about this morning, which is that poetic language, what I think of as poetic language, so imagery, metaphor, the use of details in that way. But I also want to say what you were talking about, Derek, with like rhythm. We were talking about the kind of repeating rhythm, but like rhythm used in a particular manner that's more than just for prose emphasis, I guess I want to say. Patterning is what you were talking about, like the rhythm and patterns. All of those things, I think that those have been so valuable to me with creating interiority, like finding a way to get inside of the character, the side of the character's emotions and the kind of inner experiences. And so maybe that's why I relied on it more in this novel. You know, poetry was a stronger part of the voice.
Yeah.
But you know, when you're writing about the exterior, like you're writing about the exterior conflicts, it's all dialogue and for me, it's all dialogue and action. So that's a different sort of style. But as Katie was saying this morning, they work so well together, side by side.
Yeah. We have a question from Ivan. Did you have pre-planned arcs for the relationships in the novel, or did they naturally develop? Can you talk a little about Charles and Patrick, the rest of the quartet?
Oh yeah, no, I had it planned the opposite way. This is another like irony of writing a book, right? So when I finished Centerville, which is a very different sort of novel. It starts with the explosion of a drugstore, so right away you know it's going to be very different. And I wanted to do something different. And I thought to myself, oh, I've never written a romance. I'm going to write a romance. And so I saw this relationship playing out very differently. I thought it would have a different kind of ending. And then I wrote the first draft, which I always write my first drafts pretty quickly just to see where things are going. And I realized that it couldn't go the way I wanted it to go, that it was not going to be it was not going to have this happy ending in terms of a romance, that maybe I was just too much of a realist, I don't know. Anyway, so we were talking about the other day how it became an anti-romance.
Right.
But so no, I didn't see that. That sort of developed out of the conditions, I guess, of the affair. But and then Charles and Patrick are the two other people in the quartet during the festival. And Charles is a violinist and Patrick's a violist, and Patrick's a little more accomplished than he is, although Charles plays with so maybe the most beautifully of all four of them in my mind. He really struggles emotionally. So he's a gay man. He and Patrick have had somewhat of an affair, but Patrick doesn't really acknowledge that. And even during the festival, he's caught up in that. So he and Renee kind of become confidants, and so it's kind of a parallel relationship in a way that she has with Arthur. And that came about. Charles was a character that presented himself. I didn't know that he was going to be gay, and I didn't think he would be a major character. He's a pretty major character in it. There's a couple chapters are really focused more on him than on Arthur. And I realized one day when I was writing, I was already doing the revisions, so I've been working on it for a while, thinking, oh, Charles's dialogue just comes out without me thinking about it. Who is this incredible person? You know, why am I thinking of him? And then I flashed on a really close friend that I'd had in graduate school who was very much like Charles. And like Charles, he was killed right after he left graduate school. And that was so devastating to me at the time. And I hadn't thought about him in years, but I feel like he was kind of waving at me from somewhere. Yeah,
he was a very memorable character. He really jumped off the page.
Yeah.
We have a question from Casey, an interest in the difficulty that you get into about the female careers in classical musicians, music at the time. Did you learn anything surprising in your research of that aspect of the book, about a particular musician or ensemble, perhaps?
Yeah, good question. I absolutely did. The thing that was interesting, or that I hadn't, I knew from my sister that it was difficult. Like I knew that historically it was, and that still, especially some musicians. Anyway, there still is. It's when you're looking at an orchestra, you see a lot of women now in it, but it still is hard for some instruments. But what I learned was that when affirmative action was passed and orchestras were told that they had to, these are paying orchestras, like women could be in civic orchestras, for example, but those didn't pay. So it was about the more professional ones that paid, that weren't, where women weren't allowed to audition. So then they were told they had to audition women and minorities. But what they did is, this was what I learned, they hung a curtain between the committee and the musician, and the auditioning musician, and that was supposed to prevent discrimination. But what a lot of the orchestras did is they hung curtains that were thin enough that they could see the outline of the person's body, so that they would know if it was a woman. And the other thing that they routinely did for a number of years is they would ask the musician a question as part of the audition. The musician would be forced to answer, and then they'd hear that it was a woman's voice.
Yeah.
So that they continued to not hire women for a while.
Yeah. We have another question, Karen. Are there writers who write a lot about music, even music reviewers, that you particularly admire or find yourself reading regularly?
Well, I'll just say Karen Webster wrote a great book about music, and I just read it. Based on Bob Dylan. So I recommend it. It's in similar to what had in common with my book, which I thought was very interesting, because, you know, we didn't know this until we read each other's books, is that it's writing about, in some ways, the creative process and the experience of composing. Yeah.
So we only have time left maybe for one more question, and if there's not a burning one, then I was actually going to ask you, what's next? What are you working on now? What does the future hold for Karen?
Oh, well, I am writing some poetry now, so that's part of my future. I've kind of gone back to it. I feel like this is a time that we're living in that's sort of calling out for that. I'm also, I started a book when I was only partway into the music book, and I couldn't find the voice for it. And it's dystopian, takes place about 50 years in the future. And it had a mysterious illness in it too. It had a few things in it, but that was one of them. So anyway, yeah, I just, it's funny, as I was finishing this book, I started kind of rethink. All of a sudden, I don't know, somehow or another, I thought of the point of view being a little different. I could imagine a possible voice for it. So maybe I will write that now. I'm going to write some poetry first, though.
Okay. Is that the sign?
Well, I just figured I'd pop in
Yeah.
as you guys are wrapping up here and just say what an incredible event and conversation that was. It was so inspiring. And Karen, your book is just, it's lyrical, which I know is a little punny because it's about music, but it's really fabulous. So if you guys have one more question, please feel free to, do that. But I just figured I'd pop in now.
I think we could probably wrap up, because everyone needs a little bit of time to get over to Michael C. So.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Derek. I want to say thank you to Derek. It was so wonderful to have such an intelligent and appreciative reader, like somebody who knows how to, another writer who can kind of see things that are going on in the book. And
thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
I learned a lot from you. I love that. I love when I learn something about my own book.
Then that's only returning the mini favors.
Well, thank you both so much. Karen, I look forward to reading your book. Everyone who is still in attendance, you can buy a copy of the music book through the little link below or on the event page on the banksquarebooks.com website. Derek, you are a truly skilled moderator. I think you could probably leave your day job at Yale and just get on the road as an event moderator. And,
I agree.
And Karen, keep on writing. Well, thank you all for attending. For those of you in the MFA program, you can join that Zoom room shortly. And at that, I think we'll say good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Anastasia. And thank you for
Thank you,
doing
yeah.
this and hosting me.
Thank you for coming out. And thank you to all of you audience for coming out as well. All right. Have a great night, everyone.
All
Good
right.
night.
Bye-bye. I'll see you,
Bye.
Derek.